Welcome to my second session on this short series of presentations. My name's Charles Buck. I've been involved in Chinese medicine as a lecturer, author and educator for close on 40 years, and I'm here to offer you some insights into the tradition. In the first session I talked about the statistics and presented some quite surprising and remarkable statistics on the usage of acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine in China, and also mentioning the wider context of Southeast Asia. And so in this second session I want to talk just about the way that this medicine came to survive intact from 2,200 years of continuous usage, even though we've had the rise of modern scientific medicine. And I want to make it clear that I originally trained as a medical scientist. I have a degree in physiology, and I've had a lifelong love of science. So this isn't an us versus them, science versus traditional science versus Chinese medicine or anything approach. This is simply me trying to convey why I think this is a serious and important medical endeavour that should continue into the future. So anyway, let's talk about how this all came about. Through the end of the Qing Dynasty, when modern science started to come into China more and more, and the Chinese began to question their historical tradition, they looked towards Japan. And they saw the way Japan had adopted a lot of Western ideas and a lot of Western values and outlooks and science and technology, and they felt that the way forward for China was to do the same. So there was an increasing counter culture against the traditional culture of China. They wanted to move into the modern era. They wanted steel and factories and railways and all those things of the modern industrial world. And so at that time in the 1920s, the communists were just getting going. And Chairman Mao, who was later to become Chairman Mao, was very much in the forefront of the communist movement. And communism, of course, was about science and technology and the modern world, and the importance of the worker and the trade union in that, and having a greater sense of equality in the world. And so Chairman Mao was not somebody who instinctively wanted to support traditional Chinese medicine. He wanted science, and so in the late 1920s, Chairman Mao sat on committees that voted to have Chinese medicine banned, Chinese medicine practice banned, the remaining medical schools closed down, and the clinics and hospitals that still survived being phased out to make room for modern medicine in the modern world. So Chairman Mao voted against it, shall we say. But of course later on he came to power. He had his long march, he had a revolution and took over the country, ousted the Japanese and ousted the old nationalist government who fled to Taiwan, and took control and took power. But unfortunately, in the turmoil that followed this upheaval of a vast country, there was enormous health consequences. At some points, literally 1 million people a month were dying from lack of nutrition, from lack of health care. The country was in absolute turmoil, and at that time they only had something like 3,000 Western style doctors, even though they had a vast number still of trained traditional Chinese medicine doctors. So there was a groundswell of opinion that something had to be done, and Chairman Mao realised that perhaps he should offer the traditional doctors who were still surviving the chance to try and solve the problem. And so this was when the so-called barefoot doctors movement was started, when people were taught basic acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine and sent out into the countryside to treat people, where they introduced basic hygiene measures and what have you as well. And within a very short space of time, within a couple of years, the country was returned back from normal health, from a state of cholera, typhoid epidemics and what have you. Suddenly the country was brought back to health, and this was largely the consequence of the work of traditional Chinese doctors. So this forced the pragmatist Chairman Mao to accept and acknowledge Chinese medicine. So he then said that in an about turn from his 1930s, 1920s position, he considered that Chinese medicine was a great treasure house of medical knowledge which could serve the people well in the future. But being scientific, he wanted to put it on a scientific footing. So he said, well, we're going to keep it, but we're going to throw out anything we consider to be nonsense. We're going to sanitize the tradition and bring it into the modern era. And we're going to also have research on it to find out what works and what doesn't work. So this was the way that Chinese medicine was able to survive into the modern era. He insisted that we have it on a footing. So the policy that evolved out of that was called the walking on two legs health policy. That's to say, they would obviously use Western medicine and Chinese medicine side by side, using the strengths of each approach. Around 1971 was when President Nixon came to power, and he looked back to the 1960s and saw the way that President Kennedy at the beginning of the 1960s had a mission statement to rally the American people together, which was America will put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Which apparently happened, but of course when it did happen, there was a lot of criticism of it, saying, well, we could have spent that money on better things, on healthcare, on infrastructure. We could have spent the money on things that were more useful to people on Earth, rather than just have people bouncing up and down on the moon for all that money. So when President Nixon came to power, he thought, good idea to have a mission statement, maybe better to choose a mission statement that is humanitarian in outlook. So President Nixon hit on the idea of declaring war on cancer. So here's a picture of Tricky Dicky Nixon in 1971 in the Oval Office of the White House, declaring war on cancer. And famously around that same time, President Nixon went behind the bamboo curtain and met up with Chairman Mao. This was unheard of at the time because of the fear of communism that was going on. This was a very brave move in many ways by President Nixon. So they met up. And these may not be the actual words that they said. This is me kind of putting words into politicians' mouths, but certainly Chairman Mao would have known that Nixon had this humanitarian research project going on. I'm a big humanitarian, don't you know? Have you heard about my big cancer project? My projecting words into his mouth. And of course, not wishing to be outdone, Chairman Mao thought, well, yes, we've got traditional Chinese medicine as a great tradition in our country, and I'm going to put funds into researching that. And so it's a little known fact that the Chinese government put massive budgetary investment from the public purse into researching Chinese medicine from that date, from 1972. And in fact, Nixon went back to America and agreed that America would provide some research budget for acupuncture in the US as well. And so that's when we started to get the early research into acupuncture, for example, that led to the discovery of endorphins. in the early 1970s. So that's really how Chinese medicine came to be established in China. But what if we go a little bit further back? There's this whole question of the ancient history, and practitioners of Chinese medicine like to bandy this around. And sometimes people say, well, yes, Chinese medicine is 5,000 years old, which it isn't. We've got no formal written tradition of Chinese medicine that dates back before about 200 BC, before Christ. So the real age of Chinese medicine is about 2,200 years. And it's interesting just to briefly look at the way that we moved away from a folk medicine tradition, which is a simple matching of a symptom to an intervention, typically typically a herb or something like that. So there has always been folk medicine going way back thousands of years, but this was not a medicine that was academic or where people wrote things down. It was just knowledge in the community. But it was Confucius, Confucius in Chinese, who around about 550 BC said, we need to get more rational, we need to be more focused on thinking rationally and avoiding spirits and gods and what have you. So famously, in the opening paragraph of one of his main works, he said, we advance knowledge by researching things. Okay, that's an interesting translation, and some scholars might argue with my translation, but basically that's what he said. He said in his great learning, his Das way, that by looking into things closely we can advance knowledge, and this was a move towards rationality. So this then inspired the creation of a rational, educated strata of society, of cognoscenti people who were there to advise the government on statecraft, they had experts on warfare, they had people who investigated nature and looked into the way the world works. And there were all sorts of genius, savant people brought to bear on the problem of trying to create a kind of science, a kind of new science at that time. But of course it turned out that things are really complicated. It turned out that nature is very, very complicated and very evolved. So these scholars, these cognoscenti of the time, were trying to discern underlying principles behind the way the universe worked. So they devised an explanatory model to try and navigate through the complexity of nature. They looked for ways they looked for cycles, they looked for patterns in things, they looked for the way that things evolved and changed through nature and also through mankind. And they looked as well at the way the universe constantly repeated its own cycle. So they looked at the skies, they looked at the heavens, they looked at the earth, they looked at the behaviour of mankind, they looked at the way things transformed from one state to another, the way change developed, and made an enormous study of that turns out to be a really interesting area to look into. But from our point of view today, we're just talking about the way that they were interested in principle, the way that they developed principles to navigate through complexity. And these are the very same principles that underline Chinese medicine and that have a certain amount of wisdom in them. So those scholars, as the country became settled down into a deep civilization in the Han Dynasty, those scholars were no longer employed in warfare, and so there were no jobs for them in warfare because the country was now at peace after 200 and something years of constant warfare. And so those educated, silk-clad cognoscenti some of them turned their mind to medicine, and they used the same principles that enabled them to understand nature and the cycles of nature and change, and they began to apply those to medicine. So medicine, that's what we talk when we're talking about yin and yang, or qi, or all those models, explanatory models that Chinese medicine uses. Those really do go back to the intellectual endeavours of great minds 2,200 or so years ago. And they are really useful guides to guide us through medicine, through the complexities of health and disease. And it's something that's kind of missing from modern medicine, that they don't have an overarching theory of how things work and how things transform and change. So, of course, this is very easy when discussing these things in a relatively superficial way to use bland terms that hide more deeper issues. But in a sense, Chinese medicine is integrative. It looks at the way patterns, the way everything connects together, and tries to understand the interrelations, the tidal changes in the human body, and the tidal changes in the outside environment, and even the way those two interact and connect. So it's, in a true sense, it's integrative. And to steal a quote from a great science writer, whose name I forget at the moment. Science takes things apart to see how they work, and Chinese medicine puts things together to see how they work. So modern medicine, it seems to me, has this complexity problem. When I was at university, I had a biochemistry tutor in my first year, and 2 or 3 of us used to have to gather in his office in the medical school for a face-to-face tutorial session, and he was always late. And so we'd be there standing in his room waiting for him to turn up, and on his wall was the standard biochemistry poster, which was 1.5 meters by 1 meter, with small writing with all the biochemical pathways, the fatty acid cycle, the Krebs cycle, and all the way hormones were generated and what have you, all laid out on a document with tiny letters and arrows, as you see here. This is the modern version, which has got more complicated. You could probably wallpaper a whole hospital with the complex interacting pathways of tens of thousands or more of biochemical substances, of DNA, RNA, proteins and what have you, hormones. So this raises questions, really. It raises the question of, if you examine one particular aspect of that map, if you just pick out one little bit and you look at the detail of that, and you look at the fact that the way drugs operate is to simply throw a spanner to block one of those pathways, you can see that it would be difficult in reality to predict what the hell is going to happen as a consequence of blocking or interfering with one of these pathways, which is of course exactly what pharmaceutical drugs do. Nearly every single drug you can think of works by interfering with this complex pattern, but without really a model that explains how those patterns operate. So also, it's worth bearing in mind that when modern pharmacology was founded, none of this was known. I mean, I was studying my biochemistry in the mid-1970s, but if we go right back to when people started developing drug therapies, there was none of this known. There was not a clue of the biochemical patterning that goes on inside us, the way everything connects together. And so modern pharmacology was founded on the thinking of one Nobel Prize winner. Paul Ehrlich in 1906 won the Nobel Prize for medicine and pharmacology, and he very famously in his Nobel Prize speech said, "For every disease there is a magic chemical bullet to shoot it down, and our job as scientists, as pharmacologists, is to take every disease and to find the magic chemical that shoots it down. But of course that was stated in ignorance of the sheer scale of the problem, the complexity of trying to treat, the complex reality of illness, the complex changes that happen in different diseases, in multiple sclerosis, in Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis or asthma or any of these things. There's not one thing that's going wrong, it's a whole pattern of disturbance of the biochemical dance that is inside our bodies. So this whole medicine of pharmacology was founded on an error in many ways. To give you a flavour of the way people were working who founded modern pharmacology, there was a chemist called Bayer, Adolf Bayer, who in 1890s, I think it was, decided to collect the urine from a Munich barmaid and take it home, and in his laboratory he reacted it with malic acid taken from apples and created the first barbiturate drug, a drug that was then marketed later as Veronal, and which was still marketed right up until the early 1960s, I think, until it proved so it was killing so many people. But and that, of course, is why they were called barbiturates, because they were derived from Barbara, the barmaid's urine, in 1890. So these people were not high-level, we wouldn't consider them high-level scientists. They'd be considered a bit weird in the modern era to be doing things like that, experiments like that, and coming up with chemicals like that. So it's interesting to look at what is missing from modern medicine, that understanding of how you deal with complexity, and how you deal, how you can choose to either look at patterns or look at individual things that you can interfere with. And this is not to say that the modern medical approach is wrong. It has power in many ways. It's great to be able to block things. It's great to be able to intervene on that level, but actually it's not very good at dealing with things that have a very complex nature, and Chinese medicine is I would say, better at that side of things. So what Chinese medicine gives us is principles, and those principles give us treatment strategies. They tell us we can use a diagnostic process where we can understand the pattern changes in a human being. We can look at their complexion, we can look at their symptom pattern, we can palpate their skin, we can palpate their bodies, we can feel their pulse, we can look at their tongue. Much as a person buying a racehorse might look very closely at the stance of the horse, look at their teeth, feel their muscles, feel the tone in their muscles, feel the quality of their coat, and then reach a conclusion about whether that horse was really worth $500,000 or whether it was ready to be turned into cat food. That's a different kind of approach to, say, blood tests or biopsies or what have you. So Chinese medicine has got its principles that go back all those years, that have been applied countless times to real people through history, and these give us a guide to treatment strategies. But I understand this is a difficult thing to get our head around. And so, as Ralph Waldo Emerson in the West said, as to methods there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. The man who grasps principles can successfully choose his own methods. The man who tries methods but ignores principles is sure to have trouble. Which is quite an insightful thing for a person to say who hasn't, I don't think, studied Chinese medicine, but understands the importance of underlying principles in influencing the world. So, using those principles, what Chinese medicine doctors did through history was create a coded map to allow us to navigate through the clinical landscape. It gave us a set of terminology that allowed us to see things and interpret them and make sense of them in a way that allowed us to make an intervention in a meaningful way, in a strategic and meaningful way. So this is getting too abstract now, and I think that it's useful just to deviate into an example of what this means in clinical practice, how this would actually play out in the real world in clinical practice.